فكلي واشربي وقري عينا فإما ترين من البشر أحدا فقولي إني نذرت للرحمن صوما.
Hey everyone, Assalamu alaikum. I'm Yunus Mirza and welcome to the Islamic Mary podcast. So for today, I want to speak about the Eid holiday, and the Eid holiday just happened recently. And I was curious about this word Eid. Where does it come from? How does it appear in the Qur'an? And how does it relate to biblical and Qur'anic figures? So there's actually one instance in the Qur'an where you find the word Eid. And interestingly enough, it's connected to Jesus, Isa, and the Hawariyun, or the disciples. So this is an interesting passage at the end of Surah Al-Ma'idah, or the banquet. And there is this discussion or this dialogue that you have between Jesus and his disciples about God, about faith, and about belief. So this passage starts off where the disciples, they come to Jesus, Isa, and they said to him, is it possible that your Lord can send from the sky a table, a ma'idah, and we can go ahead and eat from it? So they come to him and they are asking, yunazzila alayna ma'ida. So ma'ida in Arabic has this idea of a table with food upon it. So tawila in Arabic is literally a table, but ma'ida is more specific, and it deals with the idea of a table spread from food. And these disciples, they don't simply want a ma'ida, or a table, a banquet. They want it to appear from the sky, right? So it's not simply something that just appears or it's made for them, but they want a miracle. And this speaks to this larger idea of rizq, or sustenance, coming from the sky. So there's so many verses in the Qur'an that talk about the idea of ma, of water, yunazzilu minas sama. So the water descends from the sky and water feeds the earth, and it creates vegetation and life. So Jesus here, Isa, listens to what the Hawariyun, the disciples, say, and he says, ittaqullah. He says, be mindful of God if you are truly in kuntum mu'minin, if you are truly believers, if you truly have faith, right? So Isa here is a little frustrated that these are his followers, his companions. There are several verses in the Qur'an that speak about the idea of Hawariyun as the helpers, of the aiders of God. And they're similar to the Sahaba, or the companions of the Prophet Muhammad. So these are his supporters. And ideally, they're supposed to have faith. They're supposed to be models of faith to the community. But here they're asking for a miracle, and it implies that they don't have belief, that they have questions. They want to see this miracle occur in front of them. So then they respond, and they say here, قَالُوا نُرِيدُ أَن نَأْكُلَ مِنْهَا. So this is fascinating, that the disciples say that they wish to eat from this table, this ma'idah. And here the commentators debate, why did they say this? Like, why did they say they want to eat from it? And many of them imply here that the Hawariyun, the disciples, are people who are hungry, that they have not ate. They're from the lower echelons of society. They're not amongst the elites. And many of the followers of Jesus, of Isa, are poor and they're needy. So they want not just to see a miracle from the sky and have their belief reassured, but they want to be nourished and have sustenance. وَتَطْمَئِنَّ قُلُوبُنَا. And then they make this fascinating argument that we wish to have our hearts reassured. And this word in Arabic, itmi'nan, is connected to the idea of sakina, of tranquility, that we want our hearts to be at peace, to have the sense of tranquility, of understanding, be reassured that our belief in God and you is true. وَنَعْلَمَ أَنْ قَدْ صَدَّقْتَنَا. And to verily that to know that you are indeed truthful to us, and that we وَنَكُونَ عَلَيْهَا مِنَ الشَّاهِدِينَ, and we have become its witnesses here. So it's fascinating that here the disciples are speaking about several issues. First one is that they're hungry, they want to eat, and they want to have this sustenance from God. They want to have their hearts have this sense of sakina, of tranquility, to be reassured, and they want to be witnesses of this miracle, that they can go and maybe tell other people and call others to Isa's message. Now, this verse is fascinating because terminology and the wording is almost identical to another one that's found earlier in the Qur'an. And this is actually a dialogue between Abraham, and that of God. So in the first section where we just talked about, there is this fascinating dialogue between Jesus, Isa, and his followers, his disciples, the Hawariyun. But in this earlier section, we see that there's this dialogue between Ibrahim, and God. So Ibrahim, he goes and he says, Rabbi arani kayfa tuhyi al-mauta. He says to God, how do you bring life from death? And this is a central question, a question that many people have, the idea of resurrection, that many religions have this conception that God will bring the dead to life and that there's going to be a heaven and hell. And even other religions, there may be this idea of reincarnation. How does this occur, right? How did this happen? And then God says, Qala awalam tu'min. So speaking to Ibrahim, don't you believe? And this is fascinating because Ibrahim represents the pinnacle of faith. That in the Qur'an, Ibrahim is a Hanif, and he's someone who is understood to be a monotheist, that Muhammad was following the religion of Ibrahim, and he was trying to revive that tradition that had been lost, that Arabia had succumbed to paganism and idolatry, and Muhammad was trying to call people back to this original history, a legacy of Ibrahim, of Ismail, of Hagar, of Hajar. And then in this chapter, Ibrahim responds and he says, قَالَ بَلَا وَلَكِنْ لِيَطْمَئِنَّ قَلْبِي. He says, verily I believe, right? I do have faith. I'm a mu'min. I'm someone who enacts faith. But I want to have my heart be reassured or have sakina and tranquility within it. So here, Ibrahim is using almost identical phrasing as the Quranic disciples use. That the disciples say, وَتَطْمَئِنَّ قُلُوبُنَا, that we want our hearts to be reassured, to have sakina. And in the same way, Ibrahim is also saying, hey, look, I want to have my heart being reassured. So there's a fascinating interplay that you can have belief in God and the various books and heaven and hell and predestination, but you may not totally understand how that occurs, and you may at times need your heart to be reassured. So in this story, God then tells Ibrahim, then take 4 birds and then to slaughter them and put them on different mountains and then call them, and then they'll come to you. And then God is the most mighty and the most wise. So Ibrahim does this. He trains these birds, he slaughters them, and then he puts them in different desperate places, and then he calls them, and then all of a sudden he sees these birds come to life. So his request is granted, and in the Arabic it says arani, so show me. So he literally sees these birds come to life in front of him. And this speaks to this idea of intimacy and divine questioning, that many of the prophetic figures, that they have questions and they feel comfortable and confident going to God with these deep insecurities and vulnerabilities and even doubts. And we've seen this in the story of Mary and Maryam also, that when the angel comes to her, Gabriel, and says, you're going to have a child, you're going to have Isa, her first question is, how am I supposed to have a child when no man has touched me? So this speaks once again to this divine questioning, that she doesn't simply accept what the divine messenger says, but responding and saying, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. Then if we go back now to the story of Isa, of Jesus with the disciples. So he first tells them, you should have faith, you should be pious. And then they explain that they are hungry, that they want their hearts to be reassured, and they want to believe that Jesus, Isa, is telling the truth, and they want to witness upon it. Then Isa, Jesus in the Qur'an, he begins to make a prayer to God. So Isa has been convinced, right? So initially he was in doubt and he was chastising these disciples and saying, hey, how is this possible? You should be believers. And they make their case and they say, look, we are believers, but we want to be reassured. We want to have this sakina and tranquility in our hearts. And we want to be witnesses of this miracle. So then Jesus, the son of Mary, and this is fascinating, almost always in the Qur'an, you have Isa, Jesus, mentioned in connection with his mother, speaking to the idea of his human birth, but also at the same time, his elevated status, that he's coming from Mary. And Mary is someone who is revered in the Qur'an, a chapter named after her, and a protagonist in her own right. And he then prays, Allahumma Rabbana anzil alayna ma'ida. So then he says, oh God, reveal upon us this ma'ida, right? This table, this banquet, minas sama. So he, in many ways, he makes the prayer that the disciples want him to make. That this is not just going to appear, or they're not just going to cook dinner, but this is something that's going to descend from the sky. And takunu lana aida. And then he says, we want this flawida, this ma'ida, this banquet, to be a celebration for all of us, be a feast. And when I was researching, I found this was the only time in the Qur'an the Eid is used. And the understanding, or the root word of this, is ada ya'udu, meaning it returns. So people actually look forward to these celebrations. That in Arabic you have different Eids, and in the religious one you have Eid al-Fitr, or the breaking of the fast, or the celebration of the sacrifice. So in both instances you have the idea of, yes, prayer, of sacrifice, but you also believe in the conception of joy, of feast, that people can have fun and celebrate their accomplishments. So Jesus' Isa in the Quran is the only one who actually uses this word. And it connotates the idea of reoccurrence, that people look forward to these events. They look forward to the various celebrations and commemorating God. And then he continues and says, لِأَوَّلِنَا وَآخِرِنَا. And he says this Eid, or this feast, is going to be for the first and the last of us. So this is fascinating, and it speaks to the Quranic Jesus, that he's not just praying for a Eid or a banquet simply for himself or his companions or disciples, but he's praying for food for everyone, that the first and the last among us, that every one of us will eat and benefit. And this speaks to the idea that Isa is someone who cared about the community. He wasn't someone focused on the elites of society. Oftentimes people differentiate themselves with food. The upper class eats a certain type of food, while the lower class eats a more basic type. So here you have this sense of inclusivity, of equality, of welcoming the entire community, that he wants the first and last to benefit from this food. وَآيَةً مِنْكَ. And that this is a sign from you, right? So this is a sign that will speak to the idea of truthfulness. So earlier the disciples were saying, well, we want to have reassurance. You are indeed truthful to us, right? We want to feel that. That's the idea of sidq, of veracity, and that we want to witness this. So he's saying, I want this banquet to be a sign from God, and that people witness this and then speak and believe in my message and my truth. And then he concludes this beautiful prayer, and he says, وَرُزُقْنَا وَأَنْتَ خَيْرُ الرَّازِقِينَ. And give us sustenance, because you are the best of providers. So he connects the idea of the banquet, of the feast, to God being ar-Razzaq, or the one who provides, and that he's the best of all providers. So what's remarkable here is that the prayer is not simply one that mimics or replicates what the disciples are saying, but many of the commentators note that the Quranic Isa, or the Quranic Jesus, actually adds certain things. So he adds the idea of a Eid, of a feast, of a celebration. He adds the idea of inclusivity, that everyone from the beginning to the end. He adds the idea of a sign, of an ayah that could be witnessed to everyone. And lastly, he adds the idea of God being the best of providers. The rizq, sustenance, is from God, and that God provides sustenance to whoever he wills. So to conclude, we see that this particular section in the Qur'an discusses so many different themes. The first is the idea of the reassurance of the heart, of the tranquility. So many times in classes about religion, about spirituality, people discuss their doubts, their fears, their uncertainties. And these verses speak to the idea that someone can be a believer, but at the same time, they need reassurance at times, that they are unsure about how certain things occur. That Abraham, he is unsure about how does God resurrect the life from the dead. The disciples, they believe in Jesus and Isa and his message, but they are unclear. They want to have greater assurance. They want to see a miracle. And this also speaks to the idea of hunger. So one of the things that I'm fascinated and become interested in my global exchange work is the idea of how hunger is treated and food insecurity around the world. That there are many different communities, that wherever you go, there are people who are providing food, whether that be in food pantries or in churches or mosques. There is this emphasis on food. And this is something that religious communities, regardless of their background, often work together to fight hunger in their community. And you see that they want a banquet, right? They want an Eid. Why? Because they want to engage in akil, right? The idea of nourishing themselves, of food. And I think there is a lot of blessing in food, and also a large part of my interfaith and interreligious work, as well as my effort to build international partnerships, always includes food, right? That's part of my philosophy, is that we always should try to eat dinner together. We should break bread. We should be grateful of the sustenance that's been provided to us. And we should think about those people who are less fortunate and do not have the same access to food as we do. And lastly, one of the things I like and I really love about the Quranic Jesus is this idea of inclusivity, that when he is making his prayer, he's not only asking for himself or his followers, but he's asking for the first and the last, right? He wants everyone of the community to benefit. And I think when we often think about community, there are certain privileged people who are privileged, and there are certain people who benefit more than others. So what we see here is that we really have to think of everyone. And he wanted in this prayer to think about everyone and make sure everyone could eat from this and witness God's miracle. So thanks once again for listening to the Islamic Mary podcast. I encourage you to order my book, The Islamic Mary, Maryam Through the Centuries. If you get a chance to read it, make sure to leave a review on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. It encourages other people to read the book. You could subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. We're seeing more subscribers and more downloads every month, so I appreciate your engagement. Encourage your friends, students, and colleagues to listen to this podcast. I'm assigning certain episodes to my students, and it's been a good way to engage in the various material. Also, during the time of Lent and Ramadan, I'm always interested in listening to things of religion and spirituality, so this podcast could be of help. And we're nearing almost 100 episodes of the Islamic Mary podcast, so I've been posting pretty consistently for the last couple of months. And we have a library, whether that be Quranic commentary, monologues, reflections, interviews. I encourage you to go back into the various episodes, listen to them, and share with others. You could review this podcast, and reviewing this podcast will allow others to find it and encourage them to listen to it. It also a sense of encouragement to me personally. And then you can visit my website and join my newsletter, where you can see my different blogs, research, articles, also various events, speaking, as well as workshops regarding Islamic Mary, as well as various biblical and Quranic figures. Thanks once again, and take care.